Today, one of the things that I'm thinking about is the function of the city in stories. And I'm thinking about it because it turns out that throughout most of the kind of history of fiction as a form of entertainment, people thought of cities as where evil was, and pastoral settings as good things. And it wasn't until basically the Victorian age, when the city was probably one of the most unpleasant places to be, that people wrote stories praising cities. It was the beginning of detective stories with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and things. Before that, people just thought of cities as where bad stuff was. Isn't that interesting? I think that's interesting. Here's the recap, because this is part two of the Ghost of the Pit Fighter. Previously on the Ghost of the Pit Fighter and his final challenger, we meet Wickham Eldridge, and we meet Mr. Knott, who are our resident ghost hunters. They are ghost hunters, seance hosters, and grievance counselors. They have been brought a case by a man named Treasure Pilgrim, who is used to be a pit fighter himself and now runs a pit fighting ring. And it seems that his pit fighting ring is haunted by a ghost who has been helping underdog pit fighters to win their little fights. Eldridge has investigated the case and has decided that they're not going to take it. They're not going to try and exorcise or catch this ghost. And that's where we've left it. That's the end of the story, the end of the last section. And so we resume the conclusion of the Pit Fighter. Eldridge avoided Knott for the next day, keeping to his small apartment above the shop. Eldridge avoided callers as well, instead distracting himself with some desk work that he had been allowing to pile up. He was working on 2 books, his memoirs, and a tome that would be the most comprehensive guide on ghost hunting ever written. He knew because he had read all the others. He also hoped it would be the most practical. Brevity and clarity were his foundations. He emerged only for food and drink. Finding himself in need of tea, he pulled his dressing gown around his shoulders and exited his apartment with his empty kettle. He filled it from a tap in the kitchen down the hall. The hall ended on a landing that overlooked the front offices. The sound of voices chattered from there. It was probably clients. Knott had told Eldridge he would continue taking clients, and Eldridge had given his consent. Eldridge went to look who Knott entertained. The scene in the shop below halted at the sight of Eldridge's silent entrance, which was fortunate because it was a peculiar sight. 4 burly men removing the lid from a coffin. Inside the coffin lay a tall and thin man, with a face as wrinkled and hard as driftwood. Knott stood at the foot of the coffin. His jaw tensed at the sight of Eldridge. Knott looked like a youth caught in an act of vandalism. Eldridge had only a glance to spare for the last 2 men, but a glance completed his impression. Mr. Pilgrim and his bowler-wearing bouncer, cum valet, looked up at Eldridge. Eldridge supposed he should not have been shocked. It did not stop him from stiffening in anger. He held his tongue. Knott was a grown man, and he could sign his own end however he wished. Taking up his kettle, Eldridge turned and went back to his room. Hours passed. Eldridge tried to concentrate on his memoirs again. He found his attention lagging, so he went for a brief walk in the neighborhood and bought a loaf of bread. When he returned, to his apartment, he stoked his fire and made some toast on a poker. By the time he had made 6 pieces, he felt very nearly distracted. He sat down at his writing table. The plate of toast nestled among the papers with a small bowl of butter and another of peach jam. With his fresh pot of tea, he prepared for a late dinner. Before he started to eat, he listened. His fire crackled. The night outside had a tame wind blowing. Aside from that, he couldn't hear anything at all. He listened for naught. Whatever the man was at, it made very little noise. Eldridge lasted halfway through 1 piece of toast, and by then he found the crunching too loud in the silence. He gathered his plate of toast, his jam, and his tea on a tray. He carried it into the hall. Naught wasn't in his room, a small one at the other end of the passage. It was cold and dark and as messy as it could be for a room with very little in it. Eldridge went to the front offices. From there he could smell where he needed to go. Whiffs of ether and formaldehyde tendrils crawled from one of the back rooms. Eldridge followed the smell down a hall. It had no lights except the flicker of oil lamps from a door cracked open at the end on the left. Thin sounds of cloth slides and metal clinks came from behind the door. Nudging with his toe, Eldridge pushed into the room. Knott's back was to the door. He wore an apron over his shirt sleeves. His jacket hung over a stiff chair at the drafting desk. He glanced around at the small swish of the door opening. With a single nod, Knott acknowledged Eldridge's presence. Then he turned back to his work. The body lay on the table wearing only trousers. Fresh cuts, with fresh stitches, lined the body's arms and legs. Knott made more deep cuts in the body's chest. From the tension in his shoulders, Knott seemed to find it trying work. "Toast and tea," Eldridge said, setting the tray down on the wooden counter that circled the room. The counter was covered in beakers and tools and jars. I'll have some when I reach a good place to stop," Knott said. "In a few minutes, perhaps. This is proving difficult." Eldridge, taking up a cup of tea, went to stand next to Knott. He looked at the body, long, lean, and fit, aside from being dead, a good specimen. "Meet Perlis Grady," Knott said. "Called, until recently, Black Knuckles Grady." "Another pit fighter," Eldridge said. "He died less than a week ago. The fighting ghost will not know he has died." Knott nodded. "It will be effective in my snare," Knott said. He frowned, finishing a cut into the belly of Mr. Grady. "If all goes well, at least." Eldridge said. He sipped his tea. "What sort of snare?" he asked, looking around at the other things on the table. Some rubber tubing lay in coils with the innards of clocks along with a nearly finished battery. Knott had clever ideas about machines. As Eldridge watched, Knott started working lengths of the rubber tubing into the cuts in Mr. Grady. "I will hopefully succeed in convincing the fighting ghost to give Black Knuckles Grady aid in his last fight." Knott went across the room and took up a glass beaker and a large antique coin. "Is that the vessel you have selected?" Eldridge asked, pointing at the coin. Knott, nodding, handed it over. The coin was heavy, 1.25 inches across, and had the profile of a bear on it. It was a coin that had been in wide circulation some few hundred years ago, and it was just the right kind of neutrally old man-made thing that could hold a ghost. It had enough constructed structure and enough age to tie itself to the earth. A vessel needed to be extra solid to maintain solidarity, even while haunted. Ideally, vessels should be artifacts from the ghost's life. That always helped. The fighting ghost had never had a life, though, so Knott needed to use this sort of vessel. A vessel with enough weight to work, weight in the spiritual sense. Eldridge had discovered this coin decades ago. He had been saving it for just such a day as this. Eldridge thought it quite a suitable choice. I thought that I could construct a frame of corks, Knott said, taking the bare coin with a pair of tweezers. He held it suspended in the middle of a spherical jar, demonstrating his idea. The vessel would be less apparent to the fighting ghost if the iron doesn't touch the glass. A good instinct, Eldridge said. He took a fragrant, rough sack from a cabinet. A cumbersome method. Fill the jar with lily petals, Eldridge said, filling the jar with dried lily petals by the handful from the bag. They will hold the vessel in place, and, not interrupted, the ghost will be calmed by the lily petals as well. Yes, Eldridge said. There are many reasons why lilies are the funerary flower. When the jar was packed halfway with lily petals, Knott settled the bare coin in among them. Eldridge let Knott finish the job. The old ghost hunter went back to his tea. Without speaking, Eldridge watched Knott keep at his work. Knott packed the jar, then corked it and sealed it with wax. Setting the jar with the vessel aside, Knott began constructing the small mechanical device that he intended to put into Mr. Grady's chest that would be used to trick the ghost into thinking Mr. Grady still had pumping blood. It had fittings for the rubber tubes in Mr. Grady's limbs. Knott filled another jar with protein-rich jelly of his own concoction. He stabbed wires from the battery into it, then attached the jar to the device. The device, part clockwork, part electric, with a jar of now sparking jelly attached to it, looked a bit like a 9-inch long body of a man, with fittings for the rubber tubing instead of arms and legs. Last, Knott attached the jar with the vessel for a head. The setup needed to be extra complicated because the ghost was atypical. The shop, for a moment, settled into silence. It sounded more crisp and cold than it actually was. That was the effect of the winter sunshine gleaming off the darkly polished surfaces of just about everything there. I skipped a page. Next to hollow him out, Knott said, taking up a knife to go back to work on Mr. Grady. He will never again win an endurance contest, but he will serve for long enough. It is a morbid machine you have made, Mr. Knott. Thank you, Mr. Eldridge, Knott said. Eldridge considered how to phrase the next words he wanted to say. He frowned, watching Knott work. Knott surprised him and spoke first. You do not need to say it, Knott said. I know you'd rather avoid this job. Yes, Eldridge said, because I fear you are incapable of accomplishing it. I have studied every one of your cases, Knott said. I can reproduce your methods on this one. Are you sure of that? Knott said nothing. He said nothing in a way that said he did not know how sure he was. I am unmovable, sir, Knott finally said. May I ask you why? Eldridge asked. Knott, with a frown on his face, glanced around at Eldridge. Eldridge had trouble reading the expression, fear, focus, nerves, but his pale cheeks, the set of his lips, seemed more resolved than anything. I am a ghost hunter, Mr. Wickham. Mr. Eldridge, Knott said. Eldridge thought of 100 things he might say. One he never considered saying, though it resounded most loudly in his head, was, at least one of us is. He did not say that. Instead, Eldridge walked out of the room, taking with him a piece of toast and his cup of tea, and leaving behind a clinking quiet and the makings of a good man. Late the next afternoon, Mr. Pilgrim returned with his 4 hefty lads. They put Mr. Grady back in his coffin, and they nailed him in. Knott watched his cloak around his shoulders and his top hat and black gloves in his hand. You look pale, Gov, Mr. Pilgrim said to Knott. Need a drink, eh? Knott shook his head. He tried to say something, but couldn't. Instead, he swallowed, then gestured with his gloves to the hefty man to take Mr. Grady's coffin with them. "Will Mr. Eldridge be coming along, then?" Mr. Pilgrim asked. Knott shook his head. He looked up at the landing to the second floor. Eldridge had not appeared from his room since bringing the toast and tea down. "He's involved in another case," Knott said. He cleared his throat before producing the following lie. "He has expressed complete confidence in my ability to deliver satisfaction." "Well, Gov, you're the expert," Mr. Pilgrim said. "We shall defer to your wisdom. Come on, lads, pack it up." The hefty man carried the coffin to a cart in the street. The hefty men carried the coffin to a cart in the street that Mr. Pilgrim had brought. Knott followed, but slowly. He took as much time as he could, delaying and hoping Eldridge would arrive at the top of the stairs. Eldridge did not. Growing ever paler, Knott left the shop. He checked his watch, then the door jangled shut behind him. The shop for a moment settled in silence. It sounded more crisp and cold than it actually was. That was the effect of the winter sunshine gleaming off the darkly polished surfaces of just about everything there. A noise of clicking footsteps disturbed the shop. In a moment or two, Eldridge appeared at the top of the stairs, decked to go out. He even wore his fine white cashmere scarf, which he rarely wore except to the symphony. Resting his walking stick on his shoulder, Eldridge looked over his shop with a satisfied smile. He nigh skipped down the stairs, and he exited into the cold. Feeling energetic, he walked with his stick clacking on the grey cobbles for a block before even attempting to hail a cab. "Where to, Gov?" the cabby asked. Then he did a double-take. "Lords of Chaos, Gov, you feeling well? Look pale as death, if you don't mind me saying it." Eldridge tapped his stick against the brim of his hat, smiling like a rogue all over his chalk-white face. He had lost his color like a man barely recovered from bad influenza. His eyes sparked with a fiercer-than-usual light. Stepping like a dancer into the cab, he told the cabby where to go in clipped tones. Then he collapsed back into the seat of the cab, closing his eyes and submitting for a moment to the exhaustion. He squeezed his walking stick. It would help him anchor. That was the key, to anchor, right till the end. When he arrived at Pilgrim's Arena, the sight was far different than several nights previous. It was still daylight, for one thing. Being much earlier in the evening, no one loitered outside. The building looked like a calm barn in the daylight. Eldridge strode from his cab through the wide open doors of the arena. There were no customers in the building. The smells of the other night were old now. In the main part, the light came only from the windows, letting in the cold sun. Words near the pit. People talked in murmurs. Eldridge walked that way. The smells greeted him, ether and formaldehyde, and also a rising sweet savor of a thick cloud of incense smoke. A handful of people stood around the ring. Mr. Pilgrim stood alone at one corner. 4 men who looked like bookies huddled at another. A few gentlemen, probably prestigious gamblers and investors, chatted here and there in hushed words. In the ring, the large bouncer cum valet with a bowler hat paced at one end. He had his shirt sleeves rolled up and a cigar puffed in his mouth. He looked ready to fight. At the other end of the ring, Mr. Grady sat in a chair. Incense burned under the chair, letting off creeping breaths of smoke. Mr. Grady had been arranged in a natural pose, his forearms resting on his thighs and his feet far apart. The smoke obscured him from easy view. He looked tired, but he did not look dead. Near the middle of the ring, Knott consulted his watch. Now it had nearly begun. He looked far more relaxed. Eldridge walked to the edge of the ring. "Well, Mr. Knott," he said, "everything looks in place." Nott's expression was marvelous. It was a look of perfect confusion. Ghost hunters get used to coping with hallucinations. For a moment Eldridge watched Nott assume he was imagining Eldridge. Eldridge had enough command over himself that he quickly went over the signs of hallucination or other trickery and determined that Eldridge was in fact standing there. Nott's response was to sigh. He did not smile, but smiling was not in his nature. He did nod just a little. Nott turned to Mr. Pilgrim. "All is in place, Mr. Pilgrim." "Should be starting at any moment, Mr. Nott," Mr. Pilgrim said. "The ghost has always been prompt. The lads told it that the fight should start." Mr. Pilgrim checked his watch again. "Just about now." Eldridge looked at Mr. Grady. No one seemed even to breathe. They watched. Nothing sits more motionless than a dead man. Then the dead man moved. It looked like a trick of the eye at first. The wreaths of smoke made it look like a mistake when his hand shifted. Then it could not be a mistake. His chin lifted from his chest. Mr. Grady's face looked toward his adversary with eyes glassed by an umbral fog. Not a twitch of expression changed Mr. Grady's becalmed face. Mr. Grady slowly rose to his feet. The bouncer, his adversary, had a face made all of timidity. Eldridge looked at Nott. Nott was on his knees. He shielded his head with his hands, though he stood far from anyone else. Mr. Jack Frost had come. Without hesitation, Eldridge unlocked his focus. All darkness arose. The fighting ghost gripped Mr. Grady. The bouncer's solid spirit screamed. In the middle of the fighting pit, the absence that was Jack Frost bore down on the cowering Nott. If Jack Frost had such a thing as posture, it expressed manic glee at having Nott so nearly taken. Eldridge raised his walking stick. It was made of a shard of the black crystals that formed the bones of the world. He had a special fondness for it, as had his grandfather, and now it was a bomb made from part of his own ghost. He charged toward Frost, bringing his walking stick down on the creature. Without turning, Frost faced Eldridge. As much as the absence could express, Frost let loose an angry howl. He took a first aggressive step towards Eldridge. Laces of the black of Frost crawled up to pluck at Eldridge. Raising his walking stick again, Eldridge smacked it down on Frost. The stick broke. A crying flashed from the shards. A ripping followed. The ghost of Eldridge momentarily filled the negative space of Frost, turning the black to pale gray mist. In a scream, with all the drawing force of a receding tide, the mist spread in a rush. It could no longer hold shape, because it did not know what shape it was supposed to hold. Frost's black said one thing, and Eldridge's partial ghost said things incompatible. In splintering tendrils, the mist burst. Every tendril hooked a piece of Eldridge. He felt his crumbs ripping out of him to the void. It was not pain. Pain was material. It was terror drawn from him in little shards. Thus he won the fight. He fell to the sawdust, rising back to the light, wrenching his mind away from the inviting cold. He felt so utterly spent. Shadow flooded his head. So much psychic ink. The last he saw was not digging in the chest of the again still body of Mr. Grady. Nott smashed through the lily petal-filled jar against the floor. The petals fell through Nott's trembling fingers, leaving the bare head coin behind, somehow darker and heavier than it had been before. "We have it," Nott whispered. With those words in his ears, Eldridge fell into silent black, his last feeling of thankfulness for a final and long-awaited end. Firelight flickered on the jar. Shredded paper partly filled the jar. Nestled in the shredded paper, the bare head coin brooded, with more than the usual motionlessness of old coins. A dead thing made dead by a dead spirit unhappily held in it. On the little table with the jar sat a notebook, a quill and ink, a pot of paste, a pair of scissors, and a glass of port. The port smelled of bedtime and glinted with more pretty depth than the other items on the table, like a ruby set in crystal. It deserved a long, appreciative look. Some minutes passed, but then Eldridge's long hands opened the notebook, dabbed the quill in the ink pot. Eldridge wrote, "The fighting ghost at the top of a blank He wrote, "The fighting ghost," at the top of a blank page of paper. He wrote, "Perhaps the poltergeist known as Jack Frost," under it. With the scissors he cut out the rectangle of the words "covered," allowing them a generous margin. Daubing paste lightly on the blank side of the paper, he placed it on the jar with the barehead coin in it. Not entirely sure if he liked the effect, but decided on it. Eldridge turned the label away from himself. He sipped his port and nestled into his wing-backed chair. Making as little noise as possible, Nott entered the room. He took up the jar containing the fighting ghost. When he saw the label, his brow wrinkled, his lips pressed tight under his mustache, and he looked as if he had something to say, but also as if he would never say it. "I am tired, Mr. Nott," Eldridge said. "I may need some time to heal. The practice is safe in your hands, I trust." Nott nodded. "It is, Mr. Eldridge." "Thank you, Mr. Nott." That story was more than a little bit inspired by the detective stories of the sort of, industrial period. Sherlock Holmes and Inspector Dupin of Edgar Allan Poe's pen. I like them a lot. I thought that one turned out pretty well. I don't know where it came from. I tend to write about monsters doing the wrong sorts of things, and so that was another one. It's a ghost story that was done wrong, in my view. I think that there are conventions of how ghost stories ought to be done, and I don't think I followed them, but I don't mind. Next time, I'm going to be reading a story all in one sitting, because it's less long, that technically takes place in the same universe as that one, but it might not look that way. A question to ponder for that story, before I get to it, is how does language work? That's what I tried to write about in that. Thank you very much for your time this evening. I had a good time. I like reading that story. I like reading to you guys. The first part of this story, I will put the link to it in the description of this video so that you can go and listen to it too. The end makes a kind of cathartic sense with the beginning. I think that's how stories work, though. So I will send it to you guys. Y'all stay warm this evening. Thank you. Done and done.